In the summer of 1943, along the winding country roads between the villages of Beaumont and Lille in occupied France, a young girl pedaled her bicycle with the practiced ease of someone who had made this journey hundreds of times before. 12-year-old Marie Dubois, with her worn leather satchel bouncing against her hip and her dark braids streaming behind her, appeared to be nothing more than another farm child running errands for her family. The German soldiers manning the checkpoint at the edge of Beaumont barely glanced at her as she passed, offering them the shy smile they had come to expect from the local children. They believed she was harmless, invisible in her youth and simplicity. They would soon discover how catastrophically wrong they were. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those soldiers could not have imagined was that this seemingly ordinary child would, over the course of 6 months, dismantle an entire supply operation that the German military leadership of that era had spent years constructing, using nothing but her bicycle, her courage, and a method of communication so ingenious that it would not be fully understood until decades after the conflict ended. Marie lived with her grandmother in a stone cottage on the outskirts of Beaumont, a village that had been swallowed by the machinery of occupation. Her father had disappeared in the chaos of 1940, swept up in the mass confusion of the French army's collapse. Her mother had succumbed to illness the following winter, leaving Marie in the care of her grandmother, Claudette, a woman whose gentle exterior concealed a spine of pure steel. The cottage sat at the intersection of 3 roads, a position that would prove far more significant than its humble appearance suggested. The German forces had established a major supply depot in an abandoned factory on the northern edge of Lille, approximately 23 kilometers from Beaumont. This depot served as a crucial link in the supply chain that fed the coastal defenses being constructed along the Atlantic Wall. Fuel, ammunition, mechanical parts, and food supplies flowed through this facility in carefully scheduled convoys, following routes that had been selected for their relative safety from partisan activity. The Germans of that era believed their system was secure, protected by checkpoints, patrols, and the careful documentation of every vehicle and every shipment. What they had not accounted for was a network of resistance fighters who had learned to communicate using methods that existed entirely outside the systems the occupiers monitored. And at the heart of this network, serving as its most valuable and unlikely asset, was a child on a bicycle. Marie had first been approached by a man named Philippe Marchand in the spring of 1943. Philippe was a former postal worker who had transformed himself into one of the region's most effective resistance coordinators. He had watched Marie for weeks, observing her daily journeys to the market, to her grandmother's friends in neighboring villages, to the church in Lille. He noticed that the soldiers never stopped her, never searched her basket, never questioned why a child might need to travel so frequently. He saw in her movements an opportunity that no adult could replicate. On a morning when the apple blossoms were just beginning to fall, Philippe appeared at the cottage door. He spoke with Claudette first, his voice low and urgent, and Marie watched from the doorway as her grandmother's face shifted from suspicion to understanding, to something that looked like pride. When they finally called her in, Philippe explained what he was asking of her and why. He told her about the convoys, about the supplies that enabled the occupation to continue, about the small ways that ordinary people could resist. He showed her the system they had developed, a method so simple that its brilliance lay in its ordinariness. The technique involved modified bicycle wheels. Philippe's network included a metal worker named Jacques Rousseau, who had developed a method of concealing thin strips of paper inside the hollow chambers of bicycle wheel rims. The papers were wrapped around the inner circumference of the rim, invisible unless someone completely dismantled the wheel. Each paper contained encoded information: convoy schedules, cargo manifests, guard rotations, route changes. The information was gathered by workers in the depot, by French citizens forced to labor for the occupiers, by people who had learned to keep their eyes open and their mouths shut. Marie's role was to serve as the courier. She would receive a wheel from one contact, cycle to various villages on her usual errands, and deliver the wheel to another contact who would extract the information and pass it along the chain. To anyone watching, she was simply a girl whose bicycle occasionally needed repairs, taking her wheel to be fixed by this mechanic or that. The Germans saw her so often that she became part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the cobblestones or the church bells. For the first 3 months, Marie carried messages that helped the resistance understand the patterns of German operations. Small acts of sabotage began to occur with uncanny timing. A fuel truck would develop engine trouble precisely as it left the protection of a guarded zone. A shipment of spare parts would vanish from a supposedly secure storage facility. These incidents were attributed to bad luck, to the general chaos of war, to French workers who were assumed to be incompetent or lazy. No one suspected that they were the result of precise intelligence, delivered by a child who smiled shyly at checkpoints. Then, in July of 1943, the network intercepted information that would transform their entire operation. A German logistics officer, a man named Weber, who sometimes worked late in the depot office, had been befriended by a French cleaning woman named Simone Petit. Weber was lonely, far from home, and he had begun to trust Simone in small ways. He did not realize that every paper he left on his desk, every schedule he discussed with colleagues while she emptied waste baskets, was being carefully memorized and reported. Through Simone, the resistance learned that the Germans were planning to consolidate their supply operations. Beginning in August, all fuel supplies for the coastal region would be routed through the Lille depot in a series of major convoys. The German military leadership of that era had decided that fewer, larger shipments would be more efficient and easier to protect than the constant stream of smaller deliveries. The plan called for convoys of 15 to 20 fuel trucks, each carrying thousands of liters, to travel from Lille to coastal depots every 3 days. The information arrived at the cottage concealed in a bicycle wheel on a Tuesday morning in late July. Marie had picked up the wheel from a mechanic in Roubaix, a man who worked in a shop with greasy floors and walls covered in old calendars. She had cycled home with the wheel strapped to her back rack, passing 2 checkpoints without incident. At the cottage, her grandmother had helped her extract the paper from the rim, a process that required careful work with thin tools to avoid tearing the document. As Claudette decoded the message using a simple cipher that Philippe had taught them, the magnitude of what they had learned became clear. The first major convoy was scheduled for August 7th. The route was detailed, including every turn, every checkpoint, every scheduled stop. The cargo was specified: 38,000 liters of high-grade fuel intended for coastal artillery positions and mechanized units. The guards were listed: 2 escort vehicles, 4 soldiers per truck, a commanding officer who would travel in the lead car. Philippe arrived that evening, slipping through the garden as darkness fell. When Claudette showed him the decoded message, his hands began to shake. This was an opportunity unlike any they had encountered before, but it was also extraordinarily dangerous. The resistance did not have the weapons or the numbers to attack such a convoy directly. But Philippe had an idea, one that would require perfect timing, extraordinary courage, and the continued cooperation of one 12-year-old girl. The plan hinged on a single vulnerable point in the convoy route. Between Beaumont and the coast, the road passed through a heavily wooded area near the village of Saint-André. In this section, the road curved around a hillside before crossing a stone bridge over a narrow river. The bridge was old, built in the previous century, with support pillars that showed their age. Philippe's network included former engineers, men who had built bridges before the conflict began. They believed that the bridge could be damaged in a way that would appear to be the result of age and heavy use, rather than sabotage, but only if they knew the exact timing of the convoy's arrival. This was where Marie became essential once again. The Germans had begun varying their departure times for security reasons, never leaving at exactly the scheduled hour. Someone needed to be in Lille on the morning of August 7th, positioned to observe the depot, to note the exact moment when the convoy departed, and to relay that information instantly to the team waiting near the bridge. An adult hanging around the depot area would be noticed, questioned, possibly detained. A child on a bicycle, delivering bread to her grandmother's friend who lived near the depot, would be invisible. Marie listened as Philippe explained the plan. She would leave before dawn on August 7th, cycling to Lille as she had done dozens of times before. She would deliver her bread, chat with Madame Fontaine about trivial things, and watch the street. When the convoy departed, she would count to 100, then cycle to a farm 3 kilometers south, where a man named Thomas waited with a radio transmitter. Thomas would send a coded signal to another radio operator near Saint-André, who would alert the sabotage team. The timing would be extraordinarily tight, requiring perfect coordination across multiple points. Claudette held her granddaughter close that night, her weathered hands gentle on Marie's shoulders. She asked Marie if she understood the risks, if she was certain she wanted to proceed. Marie, whose childhood had already been stolen by occupation and loss, looked at her grandmother with eyes that seemed far older than her years, and said simply, "I am certain." The days leading up to August 7th moved with agonizing slowness. Marie practiced her route, timing herself, memorizing every turn. Philippe provided her with a story to explain her early morning journey. She was delivering bread because Madame Fontaine's daughter was visiting from Paris and wanted to have fresh bread for breakfast, a small luxury in those difficult times. It was the kind of detail that might satisfy a curious soldier, mundane enough to be believable. On the night of August 6th, Marie could not sleep. She lay in her small bed, listening to her grandmother moving quietly in the next room, preparing the bread that would serve as Marie's cover. At 4 o'clock in the morning, long before dawn, Claudette came to wake her, but Marie was already dressed. They ate a small breakfast of bread and weak tea, neither of them speaking much, both understanding that words could not contain what needed to be said. Marie left as the first grey light began to touch the eastern sky. The roads were empty, and her bicycle seemed loud in the pre-dawn silence. She passed through Beaumont, waving to the German soldier who stood half asleep at the checkpoint, and headed north toward Lille. The summer air was cool against her face, and she focused on the rhythm of pedaling, on the familiar landscape sliding past, on anything but the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She reached Lille as the city was beginning to wake. A few early workers moved along the streets, their faces showing the exhaustion of people living under occupation. Marie found Madame Fontaine's house, a narrow building painted yellow that stood 3 streets from the depot. Madame Fontaine, who was part of Philippe's network, greeted her warmly, exclaiming over the bread, inviting her in for breakfast. Marie sat at the small kitchen table, positioned where she could see the street through the lace curtains. At 7:23, the convoy began to assemble. Marie watched as trucks emerged from the depot gates, their engines rumbling, their cargo beds concealed under heavy tarps. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, checking vehicles, consulting clipboards, speaking into radios. The morning sun caught on the metal and glass, turning the scene into something almost beautiful in its mechanical precision. At 7:41, the convoy began to move. Marie counted the vehicles as they passed. 2 escort cars, 19 fuel trucks, 1 command vehicle bringing up the rear. 22 vehicles in total, carrying enough fuel to power months of coastal operations. She waited, her heart pounding, counting slowly to 100 as Philippe had instructed. Then she thanked Madame Fontaine, mounted her bicycle, and began to pedal south with everything she had. The 3 kilometers to Thomas's farm felt like 300. Marie's legs burned with effort, and her breath came in gasps. She passed a German patrol vehicle going the opposite direction, forcing herself to slow down, to wave, to appear as nothing more than a child cycling home. As soon as they were out of sight, she accelerated again, standing on the pedals, her bicycle swaying with the force of her effort. Thomas was waiting in the farmyard, his radio already powered up. Marie gasped out the information. Departed at 7:41, 19 trucks, standard escort. Thomas nodded and began transmitting immediately, his fingers tapping out the coded message in rapid bursts. They could only hope that the signal reached its destination, that the sabotage team received the warning in time, that the timing would work. Marie collapsed onto the grass, her chest heaving, her muscles trembling. Thomas's wife brought her water and bread, patting her shoulder with rough affection. They waited in silence, listening to the sounds of the countryside, wondering what was happening 12 kilometers to the west. Near Saint-André, a team of 7 men had been waiting since before dawn. They included 2 former engineers, a demolition expert who had served in the French army, and 4 farmers who had lost everything to the occupation. They had spent weeks preparing, studying the bridge, calculating exactly where and how to weaken the supporting structure. The plan was to damage two of the bridge's foundation pillars in a way that would make them unable to support the weight of a fully loaded fuel convoy, but that would not be immediately visible to casual inspection. When Thomas's signal arrived, the team moved with practiced speed. They had approximately 38 minutes before the convoy would reach the bridge. Working in pairs, they used carefully calculated charges to crack the internal structure of two support pillars, then covered the damage with a mixture of materials that made the pillars appear intact. The engineering was precise. The bridge would hold its own weight, would hold the weight of civilian vehicles, but would fail catastrophically under the concentrated load of 19 heavy fuel trucks. At 8:43, the convoy reached the approach to the bridge. The lead vehicle, a scout car, crossed without incident. The command vehicle followed, then the first fuel truck. Nothing seemed amiss. The second truck drove onto the bridge, then the third. Soldiers sat relaxed in the escort vehicles, confident in their security, unaware that beneath them stressed concrete was beginning to fracture along carefully engineered lines. The fourth fuel truck was halfway across when the bridge began to fail. The sound started as a low groan, then became a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. The center span of the bridge sagged, then collapsed entirely, taking 4 fuel trucks with it into the river below. The trucks behind tried to stop, but their momentum carried 2 more over the edge. Within seconds, what had been an organized convoy was transformed into chaos. The river was not deep, but it was enough. 6 trucks lay shattered in the water, their tanks ruptured, fuel spreading across the surface in iridescent sheets. The remaining trucks sat trapped on the far side of the collapsed bridge, unable to proceed, unable to turn around on the narrow road. German soldiers scrambled to secure the area, to call for help, to understand what had happened. The officer in charge examined the ruined bridge, looking for evidence of explosives, finding only what appeared to be structural failure, exacerbated by the heavy loads the bridge had been forced to carry. Marie learned of the success 3 days later, when Philippe appeared at the cottage, his face split by an enormous smile. He told her and Claudette everything: the bridge, the trucks, the fuel now polluting the river, the massive disruption to German supply schedules. The German military leadership of that era had launched investigations, questioned engineers, examined the bridge wreckage for any sign of sabotage. They had found nothing conclusive. The official report attributed the collapse to a combination of age, poor maintenance, and the unprecedented weight of the fuel convoy. Security procedures were changed, routes were altered, but no arrests were made, no reprisals taken against the local population. For Marie, this success marked the beginning of an even more intense period of courier work. The German forces, desperate to restore their supply efficiency, began sending more frequent shipments along alternate routes. Each route change, each schedule modification, each new procedure generated documents that needed to be reviewed and copied by the French workers in the depot. And each piece of intelligence needed to be carried out of Lille, distributed to Philippe's network, used to plan the next disruption. Over the following 5 months, Marie made 63 courier runs carrying information concealed in her bicycle wheels. The intelligence she transported enabled 31 separate acts of sabotage and interference. Fuel shipments were delayed by carefully orchestrated mechanical failures. Ammunition trucks found their cargoes subtly damaged by moisture that appeared to have entered through defective seals. Spare parts were mislabeled, sent to wrong destinations, lost in bureaucratic confusion that seemed to be nothing more than French administrative incompetence. The cumulative effect was devastating to German logistics in the region, but the danger increased with each success. German intelligence officers began to suspect that information was leaking from the depot, though they could not identify the source or the method. Security was tightened. Guards became more vigilant. Random searches increased. Philippe's network had to become even more careful, even more creative in their methods. On a cold morning in January of 1944, Marie's luck finally ran out. She was approaching a checkpoint near Roubaix, carrying a wheel that contained information about a major ammunition shipment, when the guard on duty decided to perform a thorough inspection. He was new to the post, zealous in his duties, determined to prove his worth. He asked Marie to dismount to show him her identity papers, to explain where she was going. Marie answered calmly, her story prepared, but the guard was not satisfied. He began to examine her bicycle with unusual attention, looking at the frame, the handlebars, the wheels. Marie felt her heart stop as the guard ran his fingers along the rim of the rear wheel, frowning slightly. He called over his colleague, pointed at something, spoke in rapid German that Marie could not fully understand. They removed the wheel from the bicycle, turning it over in their hands, examining the valve stem, the spoke connections. Marie stood frozen, her mind racing through possibilities, outcomes, consequences. Then one of the guards noticed that Marie's hands were shaking. He saw a terrified child, not a resistance courier, and something in his expression softened. He spoke to his colleague, his tone suggesting that they were being overzealous, that this was just a girl with a bicycle. The other guard hesitated, then shrugged. They reattached the wheel, handed the bicycle back to Marie, and waved her through with a warning to be more careful about maintaining her equipment properly. Marie pedaled away slowly, forcing herself not to rush, not to show the terror that coursed through her. Only when she was out of sight did she stop, dismounting to lean against a tree, while her legs shook and her breath came in ragged gasps. She had come within seconds of discovery, of arrest, of torture and execution for herself and everyone in Philippe's network. The reality of what she had been doing, the risks she had been taking, hit her with full force for the first time. That evening, she told Philippe that she needed to stop. She was not abandoning the cause, not surrendering to fear, but she had realized that her continued activity was endangering everyone. The Germans were getting more suspicious, more thorough. It was only a matter of time before she was caught, and when that happened, everything would unravel. Philippe listened, his face grave, and then nodded slowly. He understood. He told Marie that she had already done more than anyone had the right to ask, that her courage had saved lives and disrupted enemy operations in ways that would not be fully appreciated until after the conflict ended. Marie made her final courier run in February of 1944, delivering information about German defensive preparations that would prove valuable to the planners of the coming liberation. After that, she returned to being simply a girl on a bicycle, running ordinary errands, living a life that was as normal as occupation allowed. Philippe's network found other methods of communication, other couriers, other ways to continue the work. But everyone who knew the truth understood that what had been accomplished over those 7 months could not have happened without Marie. The liberation came in September of 1944. British and Canadian forces swept through the region in a campaign that was far more rapid than anyone had expected. Marie and her grandmother watched from their cottage as German convoys retreated eastward, as Allied vehicles poured along the same roads that Marie had cycled so many times. When the first British soldiers arrived in Beaumont, the villagers emerged from their homes, cheering and crying and embracing anyone in uniform. Marie told no one outside Philippe's network what she had done during the occupation. It was not modesty or fear, but rather a profound sense that speaking about it would somehow diminish it, would turn it into a story rather than what it had been. Necessary work, done because it needed to be done by someone who happened to be in a position to do it. Her grandmother kept the secret as well, though sometimes at night, Claudette would look at Marie with an expression that combined pride and sorrow for a childhood that could never be recovered. In the years immediately after the conflict, there were investigations and tribunals and ceremonies honoring those who had resisted. Philippe testified about the network's activities, carefully protecting the identities of those who wished to remain anonymous. He spoke about the courier system, about the intelligence that had enabled successful operations, but he never mentioned Marie's name. It was only in 1951, when Marie was 20 years old and studying engineering at university in Paris, that Philippe finally asked her permission to tell her story. Marie agreed, but requested that the account wait until after her grandmother's death. She did not want Claudette subjected to interviews and attention, did not want their quiet cottage invaded by reporters and historians. Philippe honored the request. Claudette passed away in 1957, peacefully, in the same cottage where she had decoded messages and prepared bread for dangerous early morning journeys. The official recognition came in 1958. Marie was awarded the Medal of the Resistance, one of the highest honors the French government could bestow. The ceremony was attended by dozens of people whose lives had been affected by the intelligence she had carried, by the operations she had enabled, by the courage she had demonstrated. Former resistance fighters, Allied military officers, historians and officials all gathered to honor a woman who had accomplished extraordinary things as a child. Marie accepted the medal with grace, gave a short speech about the importance of ordinary people doing what they could, and then returned to her life as an engineer working on bridge construction, a career choice that seemed fitting to those who knew her full story. In the decades that followed, Marie rarely spoke publicly about her experiences. She married, had children, built a successful career designing infrastructure across France. But she did sit for several recorded interviews with historians, and these accounts became part of the official record of resistance activities during the occupation. Her story was included in textbooks, used as an example in discussions of civilian resistance, cited in academic papers about unconventional warfare. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of someone who understood instinctively that heroism was not about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but about doing what needed to be done, consistently and carefully, despite the fear and the risk. Marie never claimed to be particularly brave or special. She pointed out that thousands of others, including children, had found ways to resist, to help, to fight back against occupation using whatever tools they had available. Her method happened to be a bicycle and modified wheels, but the principle was the same. Use what you have, do what you can, and trust that small actions can accumulate into significant impact. The bridge near Saint-André was rebuilt in 1946, constructed to modern engineering standards that would not fail under heavy loads. But local residents successfully lobbied to have a small monument placed at the site, commemorating not just the bridge collapse, but the entire network of resistance fighters who had worked to disrupt enemy supply operations. The monument does not mention Marie by name, respecting her lifetime preference for privacy, but it bears an inscription that she approved. For those who carried messages in silence. Marie lived until 2006, passing away at the age of 75. Her obituaries appeared in major newspapers across France and were picked up by international media, introducing her story to new generations. Historians analyzing the German supply failures in the region during the occupation pointed to the period from July 1943 through February 1944 as a critical window when persistent disruptions forced the reallocation of resources and delayed key defensive preparations. The intelligence that enabled those disruptions, they noted, had been carried by a network of couriers whose most valuable member had been a 12-year-old girl on a bicycle. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren have preserved the documents and recordings from her interviews, ensuring that the details of her experiences remain available to researchers and educators. One of her grandsons became a historian, specializing in civilian resistance movements, dedicating his career to documenting the stories of ordinary people who chose to resist in whatever ways they could. He has said in interviews that his grandmother taught him that history is not just made by generals and politicians, but by everyone who refuses to accept injustice, who finds ways to act even when action seems impossible, who understands that their small contribution might be the piece that makes everything else possible. The bicycle that Marie used during her courier operations was preserved by her family after her death. It sits now in a museum dedicated to the resistance, displayed alongside the tools that were used to extract and insert messages from the wheel rims. Visitors, especially children, are often surprised to learn that something so ordinary-looking was the instrument of such effective intelligence gathering. Museum guides explain that this ordinariness was exactly the point, that the resistance succeeded by finding ways to hide in plain sight, to use everyday objects and everyday actions for extraordinary purposes. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.